At the end, it wasn't an argument that changed everything. It was the quiet. Not the kind of silence that follows a fight, heavy and temporary, waiting to be broken, but a different silence, one that arrives slowly, settles in, and never asks to leave. That silence didn't appear overnight. It was built over years, through moments that seemed small at the time, conversations that went unfinished, feelings that were acknowledged but not acted on, promises that sounded sincere but led nowhere. In the early days, silence felt uncomfortable. It felt like something was wrong. People noticed it. They tried to fill it with explanations, with patience, with hope that saying the right thing would bring closeness back. But when silence keeps returning, people stop fearing it. They adapt to it, and that adaptation is where things begin to end. This is the part most people miss about the end of Sister Wives. They look for the final argument, the moment where everything finally blows up. They expect raised voices, tears, anger, something dramatic enough to explain the collapse. But drama never came, because by the time silence took over, drama had lost its power. Silence begins when people realize that speaking doesn't change outcomes, when words stop moving things forward, when expressing hurt leads to the same responses it always has. At first, people still try. They repeat themselves, they rephrase, they soften their tone, they wait for better timing. Over time, those efforts shrink, not out of laziness, out of learning. Learning that nothing shifts no matter how carefully things are said. And once that lesson is absorbed, silence stops feeling like neglect. It starts feeling like self-protection. Silence protects people from disappointment, from the emotional cost of hoping again, from the exhaustion of caring more than the situation seems to return. That's why silence can feel strangely calm. It doesn't hurt loudly, it hurts quietly, and then it stops hurting as much. Another reason silence grows is because conflict requires belief. Belief that something can still be fixed, belief that engagement matters, belief that effort will eventually be rewarded. When that belief fades, conflict fades with it. People don't fight when they no longer believe in change. They withdraw. Withdrawal isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as shorter conversations, neutral responses, a lack of follow-up, a sense that nothing really needs to be said anymore. From the outside, this can look like maturity, like growth, like people finally learning to get along. But peace without connection is not healing. It's distance. Silence also grows because it's efficient. It requires less energy, it avoids escalation, it keeps things functioning on the surface. And surface-level functioning can last a long time, long enough for people to mistake it for stability. Another shift happens when silence stops feeling temporary, when people stop expecting it to be broken by the next conversation, the next event, the next attempt at closeness. Instead of waiting for silence to end, they begin planning around it. They lower expectations, they adjust emotionally, they stop reaching as far. This is the moment silence becomes structural. It's no longer a gap between people. It's the space that defines the relationship. And once silence becomes structural, endings don't need explosions. They don't need confrontations. They don't need final words, because silence has already said everything. The next part will explore how silence replaced effort, and why once effort disappears, endings become inevitable long before anyone admits it. Silence doesn't take over all at once. It replaces effort piece by piece. At first, effort is still there, just quieter. People still show up, they still respond, they still do what's expected. But the kind of effort that comes from hope, the effort that pushes through discomfort because it believes something better is possible, begins to disappear. That effort is always the first thing to go. People stop initiating the hard conversations, not because the issues are resolved, but because bringing them up feels pointless. The outcome feels predictable. The same explanations, the same misunderstandings, the same emotional dead ends. So instead of speaking, they wait. Waiting becomes a habit, and habits reshape relationships. Another shift happens in how people listen. They hear words, but they don't lean into them. They acknowledge feelings, but they don't absorb them. Emotional engagement becomes polite rather than invested. That's not cruelty, it's fatigue. Fatigue from caring deeply without seeing change. When effort fades, silence feels easier than trying again. Silence doesn't raise expectations. Silence doesn't disappoint. Silence doesn't require vulnerability.
And once people realize that silence protects them from pain, they start choosing it instinctively. Effort also fades because it stops feeling mutual. One-sided effort is unsustainable. When people feel like they're always the ones reaching, explaining, adjusting, or repairing, they eventually stop. Not in anger, in acceptance. Another sign effort is disappearing is how timing changes. Responses slow down. Conversations lose momentum. Follow-ups don't happen naturally anymore. Not because people are busy, because urgency is gone. Urgency only exists when something feels important enough to prioritize emotionally. When urgency disappears, it's because importance has shifted. Another subtle change is how disappointment is handled. Early on, disappointment sparks emotion. It demands acknowledgement. It pushes people to speak up. Later, disappointment is expected. Expected disappointment doesn't lead to confrontation. It leads to adjustment. People lower expectations quietly. They stop relying on certain reactions. They stop hoping for certain changes. They recalibrate what they allow themselves to want. That internal adjustment reduces pain, but it also reduces connection. Another reason silence replaces effort is that effort requires vulnerability. It requires risking rejection again. It requires believing the other person will respond differently this time. Once that belief fades, vulnerability feels reckless. So people protect themselves. They keep things light, neutral, surface level. They choose calm over closeness. Calm becomes the new goal. Another important shift is how people interpret silence itself. Silence stops feeling like a problem to solve and starts feeling like a solution. It keeps things functioning, it avoids conflict, it maintains stability. And stability, once achieved, is rarely challenged. This is how silence becomes normalized. It's not chosen as an ending, it's chosen as relief. And relief is addictive. Over time, silence stops being something people tolerate and becomes something they rely on. It becomes the default way of interacting. Defaults are powerful. They shape behavior without conscious decisions. By the time effort has fully faded, silence doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels familiar, even comfortable. And when silence feels comfortable, the ending is already underway. The next part will explore how this silence turns into emotional independence and why, once people no longer need closeness to feel stable, silence becomes the most permanent ending of all. As silence settles in, something deeper begins to change beneath it. People stop needing the relationship to feel emotionally stable. This is where silence turns into independence. At first, that independence feels like growth. People feel calmer, less reactive, more in control of their emotions. They no longer feel pulled into cycles of disappointment or frustration. They stop riding emotional highs and lows. From the outside, it can look healthy, but this kind of independence isn't built from strength alone. It's built from distance. Instead of processing emotions through connection, people begin processing them alone. They soothe themselves. They manage their own expectations. They stop reaching outward for reassurance or understanding. That shift changes the purpose of the relationship. Connection is no longer necessary for emotional balance. And when connection becomes optional, silence stops being a problem. Another sign emotional independence has taken hold is how people respond to absence. They don't feel anxious about it, they don't rush to fill it, they don't wonder what it means. Absence feels neutral. Neutrality is powerful. It means the emotional bond has loosened enough that distance no longer triggers concern. Another subtle change is how people share information. They still talk, but they don't reveal much. Conversations become functional. Updates instead of reflections. Logistics instead of feelings. This kind of communication maintains structure without intimacy, and structure can survive without closeness for a long time. Another reason silence becomes permanent at this stage is that independence reduces motivation. Motivation to repair, to clarify, to compromise, to explain. Those efforts require belief that closeness matters more than comfort. Once comfort is found in emotional independence, closeness feels disruptive. It threatens the equilibrium people have worked hard to build. Another shift happens in identity. People stop seeing themselves primarily as part of a shared emotional unit. They begin seeing themselves as individuals moving alongside each other rather than together. Roles remain, history remains, but emotional identity separates. The language inside people's minds changes from we to I. That internal language shift is rarely reversed.
Another sign independence has replaced connection is how people respond when closeness is offered. Instead of leaning in, they hesitate. They keep boundaries intact. They don't open all the way. Not because they don't care, because opening up feels risky again. Silence has proven safer. Another reason silence holds is that independence removes urgency. There's no longer a sense that something must be addressed before it's too late. Too late has already arrived quietly. Another subtle truth is that emotional independence often looks peaceful. People seem composed, reasonable, less dramatic. But peace achieved through distance isn't the same as peace achieved through connection. It's peace that depends on separation. Once that kind of peace is established, fighting feels unnecessary. It would disturb a calm that silence has made possible. This is where silence stops being a phase. It becomes a structure. People organize their lives around it. They make emotional decisions that assume the distance will remain. They stop planning for reconnection and start planning for continuity without closeness. By the time this happens, the ending is no longer a question. It's a condition. Once silence has reshaped the emotional center of a relationship, it begins to reshape behavior in ways that are impossible to ignore. This is the stage where the end becomes visible, not through announcements or confrontations, but through patterns that quietly lock into place. Daily life starts to look different. Time together no longer happens naturally. It has to be planned, scheduled, negotiated. Spontaneity disappears, not because people are busy, but because emotional closeness no longer pulls them toward each other. Being together stops feeling grounding
and starts feeling optional. Optional things are the first things people let go of. Another shift shows up in how decisions are made. People stop checking in emotionally before deciding. They make choices based on what works best for them individually and inform others afterward, if at all. This isn't done out of cruelty or defiance. It's done because emotional alignment is no longer assumed. Alignment has been replaced by coexistence. Another visible change is how people handle tension when it does surface. Instead of addressing it, they work around it. They change the subject. They leave the room. They shorten interactions. They choose neutrality instead of engagement. Not because they're afraid of conflict, because conflict feels unnecessary. Silence has already done the job conflict used to do. It has lowered expectations. It has reduced emotional stakes. It has taught people how to stay regulated without relying on others. And once people learn how to self-regulate in isolation, closeness becomes less appealing. Another sign the ending is approaching is the disappearance of repair attempts. Early in any relationship strain, there are efforts to repair, apologies, explanations, reassurances, promises to do better. Those attempts slowly fade, not because no one notices the damage, because no one believes repair will hold. Repair requires hope, and hope has already been exhausted. Another subtle change is how people respond to moments that once would have mattered deeply. Anniversaries, milestones, shared memories. They still exist, but they don't carry the same emotional weight. They're acknowledged politely, not felt deeply. This emotional flattening isn't numbness, it's detachment. Another reason silence becomes visible in behavior is that people stop managing each other's feelings. They don't anticipate reactions, they don't soften messages, they don't walk on eggshells. They simply exist as they are. That freedom feels stabilizing, even if it costs intimacy. Another important shift is how people talk about the future. The language becomes vague, non-committal, short-term. There's no excitement attached to long-term plans together. When people stop imagining a shared future, the relationship has already ended emotionally. Another sign is relief becoming consistent. Relief from emotional labor, relief from explaining, relief from trying to be understood. Relief reinforces behavior more powerfully than fear ever could. People don't abandon what brings relief. Another reason silence makes the ending inevitable is that it removes urgency. Nothing feels like it has to be addressed immediately. No ticking clock, no sense that something must be said before it's too late. Too late already passed quietly. Another visible change is how people speak internally. They stop rehearsing conversations. They stop imagining what they'll say next time. There is no next time in their mind. That mental quietness is one of the clearest signs the ending is real. Another reason silence locks in permanence is that it protects dignity. No one has to be blamed. No one has to lose publicly. No one has to justify why they're done.
Silence allows things to end without spectacle, and that matters to people who are emotionally exhausted. By this stage, the relationship doesn't feel broken, it feels complete. Complete in the sense that everything that could be tried has already been tried internally. Everything that needed to be felt has already been felt. Everything that needed to be grieved has already been grieved. What remains is alignment between inner truth and outward behavior. And once that alignment exists, endings don't need announcements. They happen naturally. The final part will explore why this kind of ending feels so final, and why silence, once it becomes the foundation, doesn't need closure to remain permanent. By the time silence becomes the foundation instead of a response, the ending no longer feels like a decision. It feels like recognition. Nothing dramatic has to happen anymore for people to understand where things stand. There's no waiting for confirmation, no anticipation of a moment that will finally make everything clear. Clarity has already arrived. This is why silence is so final. It doesn't argue with reality, it reflects it. At this stage, people stop asking themselves whether the relationship can be saved. That question has quietly removed itself from their thinking. They don't debate it, they don't revisit it. It simply doesn't come up anymore. When a question disappears, so does the struggle around it. Another reason silence seals the ending is that emotional grief has already been processed. The sadness didn't wait until the visible end. It showed up earlier, during the repeated disappointments, the unmet expectations, the slow realization that effort wasn't being returned. By the time silence fully settles, grief has softened into acceptance. Acceptance doesn't feel empty, it feels steady. People often mistake this steadiness for indifference, but it's not. It's the calm that comes from no longer fighting what is. Another important shift is how people relate to memories. The past no longer pulls them backward emotionally. Memories exist, but they don't demand anything. They don't create longing, they don't spark conflict. They're acknowledged, not lived inside. That's how people know they've moved on internally, even if circumstances still look connected from the outside. Another reason silence holds is that people stop seeking permission to move forward. They don't need agreement, they don't need validation, they don't need the other person to understand their choice. They trust their own clarity. Self-trust replaces negotiation, and negotiation is what keeps conflict alive. Another subtle but powerful sign the ending is complete is relief becoming the dominant emotion. Relief from emotional labor, relief from hoping, relief from managing disappointment. Relief doesn't provoke conversation, it settles into routine. Another reason silence feels right at this stage is that speaking would feel dishonest. Talking would imply there's still uncertainty, still possibility, still something to resolve. But there isn't. Silence matches the truth more accurately than words ever could. Another shift is how people define peace. Peace is no longer about closeness or reconciliation. It's about consistency, predictability, emotional safety. Silence provides all three. Another reason silence becomes permanent is that it allows dignity on all sides. No one has to be the villain, no one has to explain themselves publicly, no one has to defend why things ended the way they did. Silence lets the ending remain private, even if the relationship itself was public. By this point, fighting would feel like reopening something that has already closed. It would disturb a calm that took years to build. People don't willingly disrupt calm once they've found it. This is why silence isn't empty at the end. It's full of decisions already made, boundaries already accepted, expectations already released. It carries the weight of everything that was tried and everything that won't be tried again. And that's what makes this ending so final. Not the absence of words, but the presence of understanding. The next and final part will explore why silence doesn't need closure to last, and why some endings are complete precisely because nothing more is said. By the time silence reaches this final stage, it no longer feels like something that happened. It feels like something that was always leading here. That's the difference between an ending that shocks people and one that simply settles into place. There's no sudden shift, no emotional whiplash, just the quiet recognition that nothing is moving anymore, and nothing needs to. This is where silence stops being interpreted and starts being understood. There's no urge left to explain, no desire to revisit old conversations with better wording, no temptation to ask one more question that might unlock a different outcome.
Those impulses belong to people who still believe something is unresolved. Here, nothing is unresolved. The silence isn't hiding anything. It isn't waiting to be broken. It isn't tense or fragile. It's stable. And stability is what makes it permanent. Another sign the ending is complete is the absence of emotional pull. People aren't drawn back by nostalgia. They don't feel compelled to reconnect for reassurance or clarity. The relationship no longer defines their emotional center. It exists, but it no longer directs. That's how silence replaces closure. Closure is often imagined as a conversation, an explanation, a final understanding shared between people. But closure doesn't require agreement, it requires acceptance, and acceptance has already happened. Another reason silence holds is that it aligns with reality better than any words could. Words would imply debate. Silence reflects truth as it is. At this stage, even conflict would feel artificial, like performing an emotion that no longer exists. Anger is gone, hope is gone, resistance is gone. What remains is honesty without effort. Another quiet shift is how people move forward. They don't rush, they don't overcompensate, they don't make dramatic declarations about new beginnings. They simply continue. Continuing without emotional turbulence is a clear sign the ending has been internalized. Another reason silence doesn't need closure is that everyone involved already knows what the silence means. It doesn't need to be named. It doesn't need to be justified. Naming it would change nothing. This is why the ending didn't come with a scene, a speech, or a final confrontation. Because the real ending happened earlier, in all the moments where effort faded, where silence felt safer than honesty, where independence replaced connection, where acceptance replaced hope. By the time silence became visible, it had already done its work. This kind of ending confuses people because it doesn't fit the stories we expect. We're taught that endings must be dramatic to be real, that without conflict, something must still be lingering. But the most final endings are often the quietest. They don't need witnesses, they don't need validation, they don't need to be explained. They simply remain. And that's what happened here. The silence didn't follow the end. The silence was the end. Not because no one cared, but because everyone finally understood what care could no longer change. And when understanding reaches that point, nothing more needs to be said.